Good afternoon. Welcome, everybody. This is Deb from the Leesburg Public Library. Welcome to our presentation from Rodney Kite-Powell, who I'll be introducing in just a moment. Wanted to give you a little bit of information about what we have coming up at the library soon, which is our Smithsonian exhibition called Voices and Votes, Democracy in America. It will be here starting November 16th through January 11th. It's free. It's open during all of our library open hours, which is Monday through Thursday from 9 to 7 and Friday and Saturday from 9 to 5. This is a very large, about 650 square foot exhibition that's on the second floor of the library starting next weekend. And it takes you through the history of democracy. Wonderful timing for this. We are one of only 5 locations in the state of Florida that have the exhibition. We are the last stop in Florida, as a matter of fact. So you're going to want to come to the library to catch the exhibition before it goes on to other states. So thank you for joining. And I would like to introduce Rodney Kite-Powell. He is the director of the Touchton Map Library and Florida Center for Cartographic Education at the Tampa Bay History Center, where he joined the staff in 1995. He received a Bachelor of Arts from the University of Florida and a Master of Arts from the University of South Florida, both in the subject of U.S. history. Born and raised in Tampa, Florida, he has written and lectured extensively on the history of Tampa, Hillsborough County, and Florida. So please help me welcome Mr. Rodney Kite-Powell.
Thank you so much, Deborah, and thank you all for tuning in. It's wonderful to be able to chat with you guys today. I'm going to share my screen, and we will get going on my presentation. Right. So again, thank you all so much for bearing with me in the technology. But here's our title slide: Outpost of Statehood, the Florida Territory from 1821 to 1855. And the kind of motivation for the exhibition was an exhibition. Excuse me, the presentation was an exhibition that we put on in 2021 to mark the 200th anniversary of Florida becoming a U.S. territory. And this was a map exhibition that we did here in the Touchton Map Library. And the territorial period of Florida really, is something that is not talked about that much, certainly not outside of Florida, but even kind of Florida history courses and things like that. It's really the modern Florida that gets the most attention, other than perhaps the Seminole Wars that took place largely during, actually, the main war took place during the territorial period. The first war was pre-territory, and the third war was actually Florida was a state. But there was really a lot going on in Florida. And really, if you look at Florida in that 24-year period, you can actually see, you can see how it is so similar to the growth of our country. So many things that were reflected in problems that we had and decisions we had to make throughout the territorial period were reflected further in the growth of the country in the antebellum and then post-Civil War era. So the first map that y'all are looking at here is a manuscript map of the U.S. as it looked in 1821. And this is not in our collection. This is from the Rumsey Map Library at Stanford University, which is a fantastic map library. And we specialize in Florida maps, so we don't have a whole lot of broader maps of the U.S. or North America. But it illustrates very clearly the status of the United States in 1821. Of course, there have been several more states added to the original 13 following the American Revolution. You can see the growth of the country as it's moving to the west, but still a majority of what is now the U.S. was either unorganized territories or Mexico. Mexico was still much, much larger than it is today, extending quite a bit further to the north in what is now the United States. Even within the kind of closer in area of the kind of Southwest and Midwest, what we know as the Midwest, you have what was then called the Northwest Territories. It's interesting to think that some of the states that we think of as just the northern part of the Midwest, Wisconsin and others, were actually considered back then in the Northwest, because it was the kind of northwest portion of the country, and aside from that large extension of the Louisiana Purchase that continues all the way up to Canada into the Pacific Ocean. You also have the Arkansas Territory, which became Arkansas and Oklahoma, part of Texas, and the Michigan Territory. Michigan wasn't a state either. And then, of course, down at the south end, you see Florida, divided into two parts: East Florida, which is the peninsula, and West Florida, which is the Panhandle. And Florida had been divided that way since the British occupied Florida between 1763 and 1783. Florida at that time extended all the way to the Mississippi River, and it was just too big of a territory for them to manage as colonies. So they actually separated into two. And so we were the 14th and 15th British colonies prior to the American Revolution. We stayed loyal during the Revolution. And at the conclusion of the Revolution with the Second Treaty of Paris in 1783, we returned back to Spanish ownership. They maintained the East and West Florida format from 1783 to 1821. And then again, Florida became a territory of the U.S. in 1821, purchased from Spain for $5 million, but it was really the forgiving or paying off of Spanish debts, mostly to American citizens, that constituted that $5 million. This is perhaps the earliest map of Florida from when it became a U.S. territory by a man named William Darby. It's published in a book about Florida because people were very interested in what this new acquisition was. And you can see, kind of, if you look closely, the words West Florida and East Florida here, covering those two parts. The Suwannee River was the dividing line. And for the first couple of years of Florida's territorial history, they maintained the two capitals of those two spaces. The capital of West Florida was Pensacola, and the capital of East Florida was St. Augustine. And the territorial legislature actually met in each of those places every other year for a couple of years, until they realized that was really any efficient way to run the government, even if you're not meeting that often. And so they basically decided a middle point between Pensacola and St. Augustine, and that midpoint was an abandoned creek town called Tallahassee, which became Tallahassee. And so in 1824, Tallahassee became the territorial capital. And of course, we became the state capital. This map is also interesting because it has those insets. Maps, map makers will kind of tell you what the most important parts of what they're trying to tell you are by labeling, by focusing the map on certain areas, and by having insets. And so this particular map has 3 insets. One of them is Mobile Bay, which isn't even in Florida, though it was part of Florida, but it's just off to the west in Alabama. But you see 2 other bays which were of principal importance. One of them is Pensacola, and then the other actually is Tampa Bay. At this time, there was no town of Tampa. There was no American settlement here, but for really hundreds of years, throughout the Spanish and even British periods, there had been great interest in settling Tampa Bay. It just had not happened. But that was due to be changed very soon. This map from the following year, 1822, again, it kind of satisfies people's deep curiosity for Florida. This came as part of an atlas, but Florida was finally included in those American atlases. And this has detailed information about some of the history of Florida, as well as some of the important characteristics of Florida. You can see its rivers, bays, climate, towns, things of that nature. And there really weren't that many towns, and all of them were in North Florida. At this time, there were Seminoles and Miccosukee living in Florida. There were maroon communities of escaped Black slaves living in Florida, formerly enslaved Blacks, I should say. And then there were communities within the Seminole and Miccosukee community of what they call Black Seminoles. And then you also did have some holdovers of some British folks, and also some holdovers of some Spanish people. But for the most part, the influx of Americans began to really populate that North Florida area. You see it by this map that the names West Florida and East Florida have been replaced by county names. The first 2 counties in the territory of Florida, Escambia County, which covers all of West Florida, and St. Johns County, which covers all of East Florida. And it's interesting because the kind of county seats for each of those was Pensacola for Escambia and St. Augustine for St. John's. As those counties became reduced in size by the creation of other counties, they just kind of shrank closer and closer to those principal cities. So Pensacola is still in Escambia County, and St. Augustine is still in St. Johns County, though they are much, much smaller in size. The following year, in 1823, is when this map was made. This is a hand-drawn manuscript map that's actually in the collection of the Library of Congress. But this map is important for a couple of reasons. One, it was likely drawn by a man named Charles Vignoles, who was an early publisher of a printed map of Florida, one of the most detailed printed maps of Florida up to that point in 1822. But he also was documenting the land owned by Richard Hackley. Hackley was somebody who had connections with the Spanish crown, and the process for transferring Florida from Spain to the U.S. took several years. The negotiations started in 1818, and by 1819 they thought they'd had a deal, but it still took a couple more years until 1821 when the Adams-Onis Treaty was finally ratified. But during that time, a lot of American speculators, land speculators, including Richard Hackley, began making contacts with the King of Spain and his commissioners to see if they could get Spanish land grants to parts of Florida. That way, when Florida became a U.S. territory, they would have these land grants and own huge parts of the territory. So Hackley's land grant, which he received in late 1818, covers all the land you see here outlined in yellow, almost all of West Central Florida, and then centered on the Tampa Bay area. But it goes up, fairly far north and goes way far south and goes, pretty far to the east as well. So it is a huge, huge piece of land that the American government had no interest in coming under the ownership of one person. So this was a map that was drawn basically to help substantiate that land grant. Well, 1824, the U.S. Army sent George Mercer Brooke to the Tampa Bay area, specifically to Tampa Bay and then Hillsborough Bay, to establish a fort here in Tampa. And so he came here and he actually met James Gadsden, who would later be very important after the Mexican War in acquiring what was called the Gadsden Purchase, which is a huge chunk of Mexico. But Gadsden was here. He met Brooke, and they decided on the location for this military fort. And they did it on the shores of the Hillsborough River, right at the head of Hillsborough Bay. Well, when they finally arrived there, using of course maps to select it, they realized there was already a house that was built here, and there was already some land that was cleared here. So they thought, well, this is perfect. Brooke moved into the house, became the officers' quarters. His men could continue to clear some land, and they began to build structures for themselves. And they established what they called Camp Hillsborough, which later became Fort Brooke, right in what is now downtown Tampa. Well, it was Hackley who'd built that house and cleared that land, and he was just happened to be away. When he came back, this was January of 1824. He came back in a few months later, spring of 1824, and saw this. There was a army fort now on his property. Well, he and Brooke kind of argued about the legalities of it all, and Hackley went back to Virginia, which is where he's from, and he sued the federal government. And this is 1824. Well, what Hackley either knew or didn't know at that time is that because of all the negotiations that were going on with the territory transfer, the American commissioners, the American government, was able to convince the King of Spain to nullify all of the land grants that were established after some midpoint in 1818. And Hackley's was one of those grants that was nullified because it came after the appointed date in 1818. But once Hackley was notified that, he continued pushing his case, as did his descendants. And it wasn't until 1904, so 80 years later, the U.S. Supreme Court finally ruled, which is interesting they took that long, but they finally ruled on the final case against Hackley's heirs, which you can imagine the difficulty if they had ruled in his favor, or their favor, but they had strong legal argument against it. Not just the inconvenience of, at that point, would have been a million people to move out of the way. So moving on to North Florida, or particularly West Florida, by 1827, you can see more counties have been formed. There's Escambia, which Pensacola was a county seat, but you see also Walton and Jackson, Washington, Gadsden, and Leon County. Leon County, of course, the home of Tallahassee. And more counties means more people were beginning to move into that area. So lots of folks beginning to move into Florida in the 1820s, mostly people from the southern states, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, and mostly planters bringing enslaved blacks into Florida. So you have what was already established as a place of using slavery through the British and a little bit with the Spanish. You have the kind of entrenchment of enslavement coming in with these new arrivals, because Florida's, particularly North Florida, very, very fertile. So you can grow, there's cotton and indigo and sugar and all kinds of things throughout the Florida territory. So it was, at the time, seen as the very likely thing to do is come in here, buy large pieces of land or get grants from the state or the territorial or federal government, and establish large plantations. And that's exactly what happened. And that boosted the population of Florida, but in particular North Florida, and in this case the Florida Panhandle or West. You also see there an inset of Pensacola, again, the primary city in West Florida, the west part of Florida, more so even than Tallahassee. It's a bigger city than Tallahassee. This map from 2 years later is really important because it shows the beginnings of the surveying that was going on in the Florida territory. Now, I mentioned land grants, and the territorial government or the federal government, and then later, of course, the state government, they couldn't create a land grant system until they knew what land they had available to them and until it was properly surveyed. And so what happened is there was a chief surveyor and a general surveyor, and then 2 or 3 surveyors underneath them. One of them was this man named Isham Searcy, and they went through and they measured the township and the ranges, and then eventually the sections of land to then be able to donate or grant those lands to people who can come in and farm them. And so when you get down to the section, there are 36 sections in every township and range, and each one of those 36 sections is 160 acres. And so it's a lot of property that they're divvying up, and it's a very monotonous process. And if you look closely in the Panhandle area, you can start seeing little square boxes, and that's the beginning of the township and range system. The other thing that's really important about this map, it's actually a very large map. It's a wall map that's over 4 feet tall. It includes one of the earliest maps of Tallahassee. This was just 5 years into Tallahassee's existence as the capital, and it's again one of the earliest plans of the city that's available to see. And interestingly, those of you who are familiar with Tallahassee, you'll note that in a lot of ways, it hasn't changed a whole lot. There's a bit of change in the southern part where the capital is. They closed some streets and, of course, had to build larger buildings someplace covering multiple blocks. But for the most part, the layout of the city is still very similar, at least that old part of the city, as it is today. Now, again, there's a lot of things that are happening at the same time in the Florida territory, and one of the most important is the idea of trade and trying to trade around and through Florida, travel and trade around and around Florida. From even the early Spanish period, there had been attempts to find rivers and lakes that you could navigate through and that would somehow connect the Atlantic side of Florida with the Gulf side just in an effort to not have to sail all the way around that peninsula. And there is no way to actually do that, at least efficiently, in any kind of large size boat. So by this time in the territorial period, there was an attempt to rectify that by creating a canal or a canal system that would connect those rivers and lakes um, from the Gulf side to the Atlantic side. So you could, in fact, travel by boat literally through Florida rather than having to go around the peninsula. And so this map was created to show all the different possibilities. So you see at the top, it has elevation changes, and it looks like, of course, there's some kind of giant mountain range in Florida. And we know, of course, the Brooksville Ridge is much hillier than the rest of Florida, but no one would say there's mountains. Um, but it does show that there is a change in elevation that would need to be dealt with any cross Florida canal. So again, this is the territorial period. And again, you can see the insets are all of the different bays and inlets along the coast of Florida that could be the entrance and exit points. This idea of a cross Florida canal wasn't officially, finally killed and ended until the 1960s. So you had decades and decades and decades of people, over 100 years, trying to figure out a way to make some kind of canal work. And it wasn't until President Nixon's administration finally killed the idea, but believe it or not, because of the environmental impact, the negative environmental impact that it would have had on then the state. This is a wonderful map, one of my favorites. This is by far the earliest map of Sanibel Island. It's from 1833. And it is, again, another kind of window into the future of not just Florida, but the country. But in particular for this one's Florida. Because this is the Florida Land Company. Actually, one of the partners in this was Hackley, as he still was pushing his land ownership claims. And this was an effort by this company, which is based out of New York, actually, to sell Florida land, generally sight unseen, to other Northerners. So they created this map to show you what Sanibel Island looked like. It's, of course, Barrier Island on the west coast of Florida, a little south of Tampa. And the idea was you could buy both a town lot, which is over on the right or the east side, and buy a garden plot, which was the majority of the island. And anybody who's been to Sanibel would be saying to themselves, a garden plot, what are you growing on Sanibel? You can grow maybe hibiscus and palm trees, but you can't grow much of anything. Well, the legend or explanation on the left-hand side actually goes into detail about how fertile the land is on Sanibel, even saying derisively, and I'm paraphrasing, but this is basically what it says, even the lazy Spaniards and Indians who used to live here could grow stuff successfully. So you, enterprising American, would definitely be able to have success. And believe it or not, you actually could grow crops on Sanibel until 1835. And there was a hurricane that hit that part of Florida in 1835 and literally washed the topsoil away from Sanibel Island, and it never really returned. So now it's very sandy. And of course, lots of hurricanes have hit Sanibel recently, again, opening and closing the different passes on either side, and of course bringing great damage to the island now, which is a huge tourist destination. So in a sense, the idea did come true that there would be money to be made on Sanibel, but it just took another 130 years for it to actually come to fruition. So by 1836, the things had changed radically in Florida. December 28th of 1835, a group of 104 soldiers left Tampa, Fort Brooke, to go to Ocala, which was Fort King, to resupply Ocala because there had been a lot of concern that the Seminole and Miccosukee were going to start a war with the federal government, or from the Seminole and Miccosukee perspective, pick up the war that they had started in 1817, 1818, when Florida was still Spanish. And they did just that. The Seminoles attacked Colonel Dade's command near what is now Dade City, and killed all but ultimately one soldier. There were 3 survivors on the American side, but 2 of those succumbed to their injuries. So there's only really one true American survivor, or Anglo survivor a man named Ransom Clark, who went back to Fort Brooke to explain what happened and actually toured the country for several years after telling the story of the Seminole War and what they called then the Dade Massacre. At the same time, or roughly the same time, the Indian agent Wiley Thompson was killed in Ocala by Osceola, and what we know as the Second Seminole War started. The prompting for that was several different treaties that the U.S. government kind of forced the Seminoles to sign. One saying that they would stay in a reservation in the middle of the territory, and then subsequently in 1832, basically a 20-year timetable to leave Florida entirely, and then a couple of years later, another one saying, "Well, your 20 years is up. You've got to go now." And so that was too much for some Seminole leaders who decided to fight back. Fort Brooke here in Tampa grew in size considerably and became the U.S. headquarters for the war. This map shows a lot of different things going on, including still Hackley's claims. But the yellow area you see kind of in central Florida was actually roughly the boundary for Hillsborough County, going all the way up almost to Ocala. And then you see in green on the coast just north of Tampa Bay, a county called Dade. The map makers knew there was going to be a county named after Dade, but they didn't know where it was going to be, and so they kind of guessed it would be close to where the battle took place. They'd never thought it would be way in the southern part of Florida in the Everglades, which of course is where it ended up being. But that Dade County, that yellow area, and then the pink, which is labeled Hillsborough, that was all Hillsborough County. The county was that size. It was very, very large. And actually part of it was the former Seminole Reservation that had been granted to them in an earlier treaty. And so when Hillsborough County was created in 1834, it was kind of another affront to Seminoles' sovereignty in the territory. So again, they went to war against the U.S. government. This is a representation of a lot of different press that was going out about the Dade Battle, again, the Dade Massacre, and other events that were happening. The only problem with the illustration is that it predates that by several years. So the illustration isn't of what happened, but newspapers use it as a representation or just as kind of propaganda to feed the war, kind of war fever, particularly up north. The war in Florida became pretty unpopular with a lot of American citizens who weren't in Florida, even in Congress. There were congressmen at the time who were wondering why we were fighting in this godforsaken place. No one wants to live here except for mosquitoes and alligators. And it was very expensive. It turned out to be the most expensive Indian war fought by the U.S., including even the wars that were fought after the Civil War out west. This is a wonderful image, Caitlin image of Osceola. Osceola was actually a Creek, not a Seminole, technically. He wasn't a chief, but he was a war leader, a general, if you will, and a really important figure in the early years of the war, and pretty well respected. I mean, respected enough that eventually there was a county in Florida named in his honor, and of course now Florida State University honors his memory and the story of the Seminoles on a daily basis. But Osceola's story is interesting. He was eventually captured under a flag of truce and then imprisoned at the Castillo de San Marcos in St. Augustine, and eventually transferred up to Fort Moultrie in South Carolina, where he died of yellow fever. But his spirit, certainly lived on in the Seminoles who continued to resist removal. Now, this is a wonderful map for a few different reasons. One, it's a very accurate map of Florida as far as the outline and the rivers and everything, although you'll notice it does not include Lake Okeechobee. There are several maps from this period that don't include the lake, and it's because the map maker had never seen it with their own eyes, and so they thought, well, if I didn't see it, it's not there for me. But regardless, the most important part about this map is what's written in the upper right, and is basically a message to Army officers that are in Florida during the Seminole War. And it says, as you're going through the territory, you have this map in your hand. If you see things that are not on this map, whether it's a lake or a river or a town or whatever feature, write it on the map. And once you've done that a few times, send this map back to the War Department, and we will use that to make better maps in the future. And so kind of think about in modern times, that would be considered crowdsourcing, but that's what they did back then. They did have, there's a great quote from General Jessup. They did have a surveying corps of engineers. People were desperately trying to learn Florida's topography and what the interior of Florida was like. But Jessup said, despite all of that, we know more about the interior of China than we know about the interior of Florida. And while he may have been exaggerating a little bit, he wasn't too far off. Zachary Taylor, a future president, was a general here in Florida during the time, actually stationed at Fort Brooke, and he did a lot to actually push the mapping of Florida, because his idea for overcoming the Seminoles was to create a series of small blockhouses or small forts spaced out evenly in a grid system. But to do so, again, you'd have to survey the land. And so surveying for that grid system was beneficial to the Army, although the grid system never worked completely. But it also was a great way to see what was in Florida at that time. And I can mention that Taylor was stationed here at Fort Brooke in Tampa. This is a wonderful map of Fort Brooke here at the south end of downtown Tampa. And there are a few different cemeteries that are actually marked on this map that have been found archaeologically, one by accident, one on purpose. But it shows the extent of the fort at the time, and there were upwards of 1,000 soldiers who were stationed here at that time, including, it's kind of hard to see on here, but a group of German dragoons. So they were not actually like Hessian soldiers brought over here directly from Germany, but they were soldiers who were recent immigrants to Germany in the kind of the Midwest area, who were recruited to come into Florida to fight the Seminoles. This is a view of that same time of what the fort looked like. You can see the interesting architecture. They actually built the barracks literally around the oak trees, so the oak trees could provide shade. So you can see right in the middle, one of the barracks is kind of literally like almost like a tree house, but on the ground, with the trunk of the oaks coming straight up through the structure. This 1839 view also shows kind of the extent of the counties at the time in Florida, and it's noted, that David Burr was a cartographer for the U.S. Postal Service at this time, and so he created maps like this of all the territories and states. Unfortunately for Florida, there were very few post offices, post roads, canals, or railroads at this time. There were no railroads. There were very few post offices, particularly south of, say, Ocala. There was a post office here at Tampa Bay. There was a post office at Key West. There were post offices at some of the other forts to the south, but very, very sparse once you got south, again, of the kind of Gainesville, Ocala area. And there were no canals at this point either. There were, of course, some of these post roads that would be connecting the post offices. But you can see, again, that the growth of Florida is reflected in the further growth of the number of counties in North Florida. And note too, the counties are all divided not by the township and range system, so no right angles. They're all divided by rivers or other natural features, giving them all very rough outlines. And as we go forward, we'll see that is less so the case as you move into Central and South Florida. And speaking of South Florida, 1842 is when this map was drawn, and this shows the Everglades. By 1842, most of the Seminoles who'd not been removed or killed during the Seminole War had been pushed into the Everglades. This map actually notes several Seminole towns in here, as well as a few American forts. 1842 is also the date that the federal government passed something called the Armed Occupation Act, which gave white settlers, either men or women, the only thing had to be was a white person, 160 acres of land and actually a firearm and ammunition. And if you remained on that land for 5 years, you get to keep everything for free. And you had to maintain the land, grow crops, that kind of thing. But not, of course, across the entire length of it, just a portion of it. The only caveat aside from your race was that you couldn't, no land was offered within a certain distance of established forts and towns. So you had to be 10, 20 miles away from some of those established places. But that's how, smaller towns around these bigger cities historically started to grow, was because of the armed occupation, particularly in central and south Florida. In particular, Manatee County, what became Sarasota County, Orange County, which was originally Mosquito County, not really the best name when you think about promoting your county. So it's easy to see why they went from Mosquito to Orange. But those counties began to really grow and really be created and then grow during this time of the Armed Occupation Act, which again was passed in 1842. This also shows Florida in 1842, and you can see those squares are beginning to be pushed further and further south. Again, that represents the township and ranges that are cropping up and being pushed further south, which allows, again, more of these grants to be awarded. You can also see a little more of an extensive transportation system within the interior, a few more roads being established, or maybe widened versions of some former American Indian trails and things like that. But despite that, all of the growth in Florida was still in North Florida, with the exception of a few coastal cities, again, like places like Tampa and Key West. Key West, eventually, the later part of the 19th century, would become the largest city in Florida. And then the interior was still neglected to some degree, unless you were close to a navigable river or something like that, which would allow your town to grow. Also, it's kind of hard to see here, but you'll see kind of in the middle of the peninsula the words Lee Reed, Leighread. There's going to be a county named for Lee Reed, who was at the wrong end of a duel in Tallahassee. But Governor Call, who was no friend of Reed's, failed to sign the authorization papers for the county, so it was never created. Oops. Here we have 1845, again, with Robert Butler, who was the chief surveyor for Florida. Now you can see by 1845, which is when Florida became a state, the surveys going all the way south of Tampa Bay, at least on this west central part of Florida, but not into the Everglades. They just couldn't push that far south. But they had made a tremendous amount of progress over the past 20 years or so, including, of course, during wartime. So very dangerous work for the surveyors. But they had done a tremendous job in surveying the state. And then here we go with a map of Florida showing the counties. Again, you see the size of Hillsborough at this time. Manatee had been created. Benton County, named for Thomas Hart Benton. That was Hernando. It was changed to Benton briefly. Went back to Hernando after a few years. But you also, for the first time, you see some north-south dividing lines between counties that are on a straight line versus following the path of a river or some other natural feature. And that's the beginnings of the more squared off counties that you see in Central and South Florida today. There are also larger counties in size. And that's just as the counties grew, they didn't continue dividing them up. As a number of counties grew, I should say, they didn't continue dividing them up. They just had more territory in which to create new counties. And so as you look at Florida, on the north end, there are lots of small counties, all irregularly shaped. And then if you look at a map of Florida today, you'll see Central and South Florida with larger counties that are more block-like in nature. And that's exactly how the U.S. Grew from east to west. And so here we are, 1845. Florida is now a state, along with other states like Michigan and Illinois, and Illinois had already been a state, but Iowa for one. At this time, as states were being admitted to the Union, as part of, I believe it was the Missouri Compromise. I forget which compromise, to be honest with you, I apologize. But one of these compromises over the growth of slavery throughout the U.S. territories and throughout the country, they began admitting a free state and a slave state around the same time. And Florida was admitted as a slave state, and Iowa was admitted as a free state. So Iowa was our companion state on the free side. You can also see the growth of the country as it continues to move Further west, by this point, 1845, we have acquired Texas, although its western boundary was still a bit up in the air. And then they further delineated what they call the Indian Territory as the removal of native people from the east side of the Mississippi continued to the west side of the Mississippi. But you still have Mexico going all the way up and including almost, or I guess all of California. But you do have other territories being established as well, including Oregon and the kind of misnomer of the Missouri Territory up in the Northwest, because you already had the state of Missouri that was established by this time. So you can see again how the country is continuing to grow even as Florida was growing. But what happened, certainly, before the Civil War, but really after the Civil War, the focus of growth, actually before the war because of the discovery of gold in 1849 in California, the acquisition of those territories, the focus of growth was really going further to the west. So Florida was kind of a forgotten frontier. And this is kind of an interesting tidbit as it relates to the railroads. There was a railroad that connected the east coast of the U.S. and the west coast of the U.S., the Transcontinental Railroad, that was connected in 1869. So that's about 20 years before someone could take a railroad train from New York, say, to Miami. And that's just how much the growth across the country was the focus, and very little focus on the growth within Florida. Florida was, again, like I said, kind of a neglected state, the smallest state on the east side of the Mississippi for some time. And it really wasn't until 100 years later, after this map was created, so after World War II, the conclusion of World War II, that Florida began to really take off and grow as the state that we all know and love today. So with that, I thank you all so very, very much. I need to show you this last slide, and I need to read you this last bit from the Humanities Council. Then I'd be happy to take questions if there are any. Thank you for your time and attention. This presentation today was funded by Florida Humanities and is sponsored in part by the state of Florida, Department of State, the Division of Arts and Culture, and the Council on Arts and Culture. Florida Humanities appreciates feedback about your experience today. Follow the prompts on the screen. So you have two QR codes that you can use with your phone or iPad or whatever you happen to have to complete these surveys and share your thoughts about the program. Anybody happens to be in person, there might be surveys there that you can use as well. For the latest information and to find other events near you, we encourage you to sign up for Florida Humanities newsletters. And I will say, if you're unable to sign up for the newsletters or the program survey through this QR code, if you either contact me or you go on the Humanities Council website, you should be able to find that survey and that newsletter. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'm going to thank you all so much.